He fined her without even letting her speak. But what he didn't see coming was the quiet fury of a woman fighting for justice, with the law as her weapon. What she did next? It changed everything. Karoline Leavitt didn't grow up with privilege. She didn't have a silver spoon, a family legacy in law, or powerful connections to open doors. What she had was a front-row seat to a deeply personal injustice. Watching her mother, a hard-working woman who ran a small tailoring shop out of their garage, get crushed by a legal system she didn't understand. Karoline was just 12 when the lawsuit came. A local developer wanted the land their house stood on and claimed there had been a zoning violation going back 20 years. Her mother had no lawyer, no resources, and no idea how to fight. Karoline watched the woman she loved most in the world, who never missed a day of work, who always paid her taxes, who helped neighbors without ever expecting anything in return, be reduced to tears in front of a cold, unsympathetic courtroom. The case dragged on for months, draining them financially and emotionally, and though they eventually kept the home, the damage was already done. That day changed Karoline forever. She didn't cry. She didn't complain. She got angry, quietly, purposefully, and with a clarity that most adults never find. By 16, she was spending weekends in the law section of the public library while other kids were at the movies. By 19, she was correcting her professors in constitutional law seminars, not to show off, but because she saw what they missed. And by 25, she had already earned a reputation, on the streets more than in the courts, as someone you called when you couldn't afford a lawyer but needed justice. Her passion wasn't built in a classroom. It was forged in pain, in watching the people she cared about be dismissed, disrespected, and discarded by a system that too often only listens to those who speak its language. Karoline made it her mission to learn that language better than anyone else. But even with that fire in her bones, people didn't take her seriously. She looked young, she smiled too much, and she didn't walk into courtrooms with a briefcase and a three-piece suit. She carried a weathered leather notebook filled with annotations, scribbles, and battle plans. Judges ignored her. Opposing attorneys scoffed. Secretaries assumed she was someone's assistant. But Karoline never raised her voice. She knew her worth and she knew the law. Still, the world isn't always fair to quiet strength. One early fall morning, she was called to represent a client in a seemingly mundane case, a zoning violation against a small business owner in a dusty corner of town. It should have been a formality. No media, no audience. Just another file, in the judge's stack. But this case wasn't what it appeared to be. The man she was defending, Mr. Howard Langston, was a Korean War veteran who had run his hardware store for over 4 decades, serving 3 generations of local families. He paid his taxes, gave credit to people down on their luck, and never once asked for a government handout. But suddenly, the city decided his store was in violation of an obscure zoning amendment passed 2 years prior, one that conveniently made his corner lot a prime target for a new commercial development project. Howard couldn't understand how or why he was being pushed out. All he had was Karoline. She read the case file front to back, then again, and a third time. Something didn't sit right. The dates didn't match. The notices weren't properly filed. The zoning law itself seemed hastily written. She dug deeper, pulling public records, council meeting minutes, even handwritten notes from a retired clerk who remembered the rushed vote on the amendment. What she found pointed to something more than just a mistake. It hinted at a quiet campaign to displace long-standing businesses under the guise of urban renewal. Karoline walked into that courtroom that Tuesday morning not just to defend a man, but to stand up for every forgotten soul pushed aside by bureaucracy and greed. And if you've ever been in a room where the people in power barely look up when you speak, where they think they already know who you are based on your age, your voice, your face, then you know exactly how she felt. If you believe in justice, in standing up for those who get silenced, and in restoring a little dignity to the forgotten corners of this country, then this is the kind of story you'll want to follow. These aren't just legal battles. They're personal wars fought by ordinary Americans who still believe in what's right. So if you're the kind of man who knows what it means to be underestimated, who's had to fight twice as hard just to be heard, subscribe now, because every week we share real stories like this one. Stories of courage, grit, and quiet redemption. Stories that don't make headlines but deserve to be remembered. And this one? It's about to take a turn. Because the moment Karoline tried to speak, the judge didn't just dismiss her argument. He fined her for contempt, accused her of wasting the court's time, and told her to come back when you're prepared. Karoline had barely crossed the threshold of that dim, echoing courtroom when she felt the air shift, thick with the kind of contempt that doesn't come from words, but from glances, smirks, the kind of subtle dismissal that men of a certain power and age can wield like a sword. The opposing attorney, Richard Halbrook, stood a full head taller than Karoline and carried himself like a man who hadn't been told no since Reagan was in office. His tailored gray suit, his polished cufflinks, his slow, deliberate steps all screamed confidence bordering on arrogance. As Karoline set her leather-bound notebook on the table, Halbrook leaned in just enough to make sure only she could hear him. "Shouldn't you be in a classroom?" he whispered, eyes gleaming with condescension. Karoline didn't respond. She just opened her notes and exhaled slowly. But the judge, well, he didn't bother with whispers. From the moment he saw her name on the file, something shifted in his demeanor. Judge Ronald Kessler had been on the bench longer than Karoline, had been alive. He was known for his impatience and a particular disdain for what he called rookie lawyering. As he flipped through the file, his face twisted in irritation. "This case should have been dismissed before it landed on my desk," he muttered, more to the room than to anyone specific. "Let's make this quick." Karoline stood to speak, her voice calm but unwavering, and barely got past her opening statement when Halbrook interrupted with a motion to admit new evidence, photos and documents Karoline had never seen. She rose immediately, objecting on the grounds that the evidence had not been submitted within the timeline required by the court. It was a basic procedural rule, one drilled into every first-year law student. But the judge didn't even let her finish. "Ms. Leavitt, we're not here for lectures on courtroom protocol," he snapped. "If you knew the rules, you would have filed your objection properly." Then came the sound that silences a room, the crack of the gavel. $500 for wasting this court's time. Contempt. You could feel the disbelief ripple through the room. Not outrage, just that quiet tension that settles in when something clearly unfair happens, and no one's sure if it's safe to speak up. Karoline's client, Mr. Langston, looked at her with confusion and quiet panic, the kind that comes from a man who's fought in war but suddenly feels helpless in a courtroom. Karoline could have backed down. She could have swallowed the fine, bowed her head and waited for the next break in the storm. But she didn't. She stood straighter, gathered her notes with steady hands, and looked the judge in the eye. "Your Honor, if you'll allow me, I'd like to walk the court through why that evidence should not only be dismissed, but why this entire case stands on illegal grounds." That one sentence shifted everything. There was no arrogance in her voice, just clarity, just truth. The courtroom, which had felt half asleep minutes before, suddenly buzzed with silent electricity. The bailiff, who had been casually scrolling through his phone behind the desk, set it down. A man in the back row, who had been nodding off, straightened in his seat. Halbrook stopped shuffling his papers. Even the judge blinked, visibly surprised by her calm defiance. Karoline began to speak, citing specific city ordinances, timelines, and procedural missteps. She referenced a zoning change that had passed in a council meeting with no public notice, a violation of municipal law. She explained how the submitted evidence violated discovery rules and demonstrated a prejudicial timeline that suggested more than coincidence. But with every word she spoke, the judge's face tightened. His pride was clearly bruised. Instead of listening, he began looking for ways to cut her off, interrupting with questions that barely concealed his annoyance. "Where exactly did you get this information? How do I know this isn't a misinterpretation? Do you even have standing to make that argument?" It wasn't about the facts anymore. It was about control. Karoline pushed forward, respectfully but firmly, and every man in that room, whether they admitted it or not, recognized the courage it took. Because it wasn't just about defending her client anymore. It was about defending herself, her integrity, her right to be there. And it was a fight too many good people know all too well, the kind where you come armed with the truth, and the system throws shade and silence in return. The judge eventually silenced her again, reminding her that the court would not entertain conspiracy theories or secondhand speculation. Karoline returned to her seat without a word, but anyone watching closely could see it. She wasn't defeated. She was calculating, and maybe that's what rattled them. Halbrook, who had smirked so confidently earlier, now shuffled his papers without that same bravado. Because the truth is, men like him, and judges like Kessler, aren't used to being challenged by someone they underestimate. The rest of the day played out in a blur of motions and dismissals, with the judge refusing to consider key documents Karoline had prepared, labeling them irrelevant, without reading them. By the end of it, the courtroom was no longer just a place of legal debate. It had become a stage for quiet humiliation. Not because Karoline had made a mistake, but because she had done everything right and was still dismissed. The weight of it all hit her the moment she stepped outside into the hallway, where her client placed a trembling hand on her shoulder and asked, "Did I do something wrong?" She looked him in the eyes and said, "No, Mr. Langston. You didn't." They did. That night, she sat in her apartment surrounded by crumpled notes, court transcripts, and a cup of coffee gone cold. She didn't sleep. Instead, she reviewed every minute of that hearing, every objection ignored, every precedent she had cited. And as the sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Karoline pulled out a legal pad and wrote one sentence, across the top in bold ink: "This isn't over." And then, in the stillness of that early morning, she did something that would shake the entire courthouse within 48 hours. She filed a misconduct complaint against the judge himself. Despite everything she'd studied, everything she'd prepared, and every shred of calm she carried with her into that courtroom, it was clear by the second day that Karoline Leavitt was walking into a battle that had already been rigged. The moment she stepped through the heavy wooden doors, the glares and smirks hit her like cold air, sharp, silent, and meant to keep her in her place. The courtroom wasn't just indifferent anymore. It was actively hostile. The judge barely looked at her when she addressed him. The opposing counsel, Halbrook, sat with his arms folded and a grin that said he'd already written the ending of this story in his head. And it wasn't just them. The spectators, mostly folks waiting on traffic tickets and family court matters, whispered, just loud enough for Karoline to hear, "She's wasting her time. She'll learn the hard way. These young ones think they can just walk in and change things." Karoline kept her shoulders square, her eyes forward, but inside she felt the kind of weight that doesn't come from fear. It comes from watching a system meant to uphold justice instead weaponize its own rules to break it. The judge declared that her key witness, an urban planner who had once worked on the very zoning map being debated, would not be allowed to testify because Karoline had allegedly missed the submission deadline by 12 hours. She knew she hadn't. She'd filed it 2 days before the deadline with a timestamp to prove it. But when she asked the clerk for a copy, the form was mysteriously not in the file. That's when she realized it wasn't incompetence. It was intent. Someone had decided she didn't belong here, and they were going to prove it the old-fashioned way, by tying her down with procedural red tape and slicing up her case until there was nothing left to stand on. Then came the missing exhibit. It was a single-page document she had pulled from a public archive weeks earlier, a zoning variance granted in the 1990s that directly contradicted the city's current claims against her client. Without it, the heart of her defense was gone. She'd submitted it properly. It had been stamped, notarized, cataloged, and yet, when she asked the court to enter it into evidence, the clerk raised an eyebrow and said, "It's not in the packet." Karoline felt the blood drain from her face. It was like being mugged in broad daylight with the cops standing. By doing nothing, she turned to the judge, who simply sighed and said, "Ms. Leavitt, if you can't keep your documentation in order, I can't help you." It wasn't just dismissal, it was public humiliation, and it landed like a slap. Her client, Mr. Langston, a man in his 70s with calloused hands and tired eyes, leaned over and whispered, "We should just let it go. This isn't worth it." But that's the thing about Karoline. She knew too many people who had let it go. She'd seen her mother lose everything over a legal technicality that no one had cared enough to fix. She had promised herself that she wouldn't let anyone else be steamrolled just because the system had grown too comfortable crushing the quiet ones. So she stayed. She fought through every motion, objected when she could, argued with a quiet, simmering fury. And still, they shut her down. Every time. Halbrook submitted new documents mid-trial, documents that should have been thrown out immediately, but the judge allowed them in. In the interest of expediency, he said. Karoline raised a hand to object and was warned that another outburst would double her contempt fine. It wasn't just a loss, it was a dismantling. Every piece of her case was peeled away, not by stronger evidence or sharper arguments, but by a courtroom that had decided before she ever spoke that she didn't deserve to be heard. That evening, she walked out of the courthouse into a sky just beginning to darken, the sun dipping below. The brick rooftops like it too had seen enough. Her shoes ached, her voice was hoarse, and the paper folder she clutched in her hand was so thin now, so empty, it barely made a sound as she walked. At home, she didn't turn on the lights. She sat in the silence, in the dark, surrounded by transcripts, notes, her worn laptop still open on the dining room table. The humiliation stung, but what cut deeper was the betrayal, not just from the court, but from the very ideals she'd built her life around. She believed in the law, she believed in fairness, but that courtroom had shown her something she wasn't ready to see. That sometimes those who speak truth the loudest are the ones most punished for it. She thought about Mr. Langston's shop, with its worn wood counters and hand-painted signs, about the memories that filled its narrow aisles, about the generations that had walked through its door. She thought about how his voice cracked when he said, "Maybe we just move on." And she thought about how many other people had lost everything because they trusted a process that didn't protect them. That night, as the streetlights flickered on outside and cast long shadows across her walls, Karoline opened her laptop, not to research, not to prepare for court, but to write a letter. It wasn't to the judge. It wasn't even to the bar association. It was addressed to every city council member whose signature had ever appeared on a zoning ordinance. And it began with the words, "I believe the public has a right to know." Because even if she couldn't win in that courtroom, she was going to take this fight where they couldn't mute her, into the open. But as she clicked send on the last email, her phone buzzed with a message from a blocked number. "Back off or you'll lose more than just a case." Karoline didn't close her eyes once that night, not out of fear, but out of fire. She sat at her kitchen table beneath the dim hum of the overhead light, surrounded by court transcripts, stacks of legal code, city council meeting notes, and printed zoning maps that had become her battlefield. Her hands trembled not from doubt, but from the surge of something she hadn't let herself feel in days: righteous defiance. She reviewed every moment of the hearing, rewound every insult, every misstep, every time the gavel came down not for justice but for control. And slowly, word by word, sentence by sentence, she wrote her answer. By sunrise, her 27-page motion was done. It was not just a rebuttal, it was a masterclass in jurisprudence. It cited decades of case law, including decisions authored by the very judge who fined her, calling out how his ruling not only contradicted his own record, but violated basic principles of due process. She broke down the procedural sabotage piece by piece, how her evidence was mishandled, how her witness was denied without grounds, how the opposing counsel's late submissions had been accepted in clear breach of court deadlines. And she didn't stop there. She filed a formal complaint with the State Bar Association, attaching affidavits, timelines, emails, and scanned receipts. The complaint wasn't emotional, it was surgical. No accusations, just facts. No rage, just resolve. And when word began to spread that a young woman had dared to challenge a sitting judge with this level of precision, the legal world took notice. Within 48 hours, Karoline was summoned back to court. But this time, everything had changed. Reporters lined the courthouse steps. Law students from nearby universities packed the back rows. Civil rights attorneys who'd never met her stood shoulder to shoulder with local business owners just hoping someone would finally hold the system accountable. The judge walked in slower this time, eyes heavier, clearly aware that the balance of power had shifted. The air was different now, thick with anticipation, not dismissal. Karoline stood, hands steady, voice clear. She didn't grandstand, she didn't gloat. She simply walked the room through every misstep, every missing file, every rule bent, out of shape. She presented the zoning amendment that had been quietly updated by the city, an amendment that required all property owners to be notified in writing, which had never happened. She cross-referenced meeting minutes, showed the discrepancy between the official record and what had been submitted in court, and then, in a quiet crescendo, unveiled the document that had nearly disappeared. The original zoning variance issued, decades earlier, that made the city's entire case not only flawed, but invalid. The room went silent. Even Halbrook, the smug opposing attorney, sat frozen as Karoline shifted to her final point, a pattern of selective enforcement. She revealed, using property records and public complaints, that multiple long-standing businesses, especially those owned by older residents, had been targeted by the same office for minor violations, while newer developers faced none. The implications were undeniable. It wasn't law, it was politics. And in exposing it, Karoline had not only defended her client, she had held a mirror to the court itself. When she finished, she stepped back and waited. The judge, who just a week ago had fined her for speaking out of turn, now sat in silence. His fingers tapped against the bench. His jaw was tight, and finally, he spoke. "I've never seen a more thorough argument from anyone." Then, as if releasing something heavy from his chest, he added, "The fine is reversed, the motion is granted, the case is dismissed." There was no eruption, no cheers. Just a wave of quiet applause, slow, steady, reverent. It wasn't just for her skill. It was for the moment, for the proof that sometimes truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs to be undeniable. Mr. Langston, tears in his eyes, reached out and squeezed her hand. "You saved my life," he whispered. But Karoline didn't cry. She simply nodded, because she knew this wasn't the end of the fight. This was just the moment the world finally started paying attention. And as the cameras rolled and the reporters began scribbling furiously, one of them asked, "What will you do next?" Karoline paused, glanced back at the judge's bench, then at the court staff who now avoided her eyes, and said, "Next, we talk about what else has been hidden in this courthouse." News of Karoline Leavitt's victory didn't just ripple through the local community. It spread like quiet wildfire, not in screaming headlines, but in whispered admiration across legal circles, neighborhood diners, and old courtrooms where people still believed in the law's original promise, fairness. It wasn't the overturned fine that caught attention. It wasn't even the dismissed case. It was the way she had done it, with humility, precision, and a fire that didn't burn bridges but lit paths for others. Retired attorneys began mentioning her name in lectures. Veterans of the courtroom, men with graying beards and decades of trial scars, wrote letters thanking her for reminding them why they once stepped into law school. And the judge, the very man who'd fined her without a second thought, called her into chambers one morning, not to scold, not to correct, but to offer her a clerkship. "You made me better," he said quietly, staring not at her but at the law books behind her, as if they suddenly carried new meaning. Karoline thanked him sincerely, but said no, because something had shifted in her, and she knew now what her role was, not to interpret the law for the powerful, but to equip the overlooked to defend themselves with it. She returned to her small office, which doubled as her home for a while, and opened a non-profit legal aid center with the money she'd saved, and donations that came from all over, from veterans, shop owners, single moms, and even one anonymous. Check that simply read, "Thank you for standing up when the rest of us couldn't." She filled the rooms with second-hand desks, battered bookshelves, and a handful of young law graduates who reminded her of herself, eager, unsure, and burning with the same quiet sense of purpose. Every week, she taught them not just how to argue a case, but how to read people, how to listen, how to stay upright when the room turns against you. She'd stand at the front of the tiny classroom and say, "The law isn't justice by default. It's just a tool. You make it justice. You shape it by what you do with it when it fails the people who trust it." Her first client, Mr. Langston, now volunteers at the center, fixing leaky pipes and passing out coffee, still telling anyone who will listen that, "Karoline saved my shop, but more than that, she reminded me I mattered." Reporters still call. Universities ask her to speak. Big firms dangle offers she barely reads. But Karoline stays where she is, rooted not by pride, but by purpose. And maybe that's what resonates most with the men who hear her story. The fathers, the grandfathers, the veterans, the small business owners who know what it feels like to be overlooked, dismissed, or told their fight isn't worth it. They see in Karoline not just a sharp legal mind, but a spirit that never backed down, even when the system closed ranks. Her story is not about defiance for its own sake. It's about grace under pressure, about refusing to trade your values for a seat at the table, about remembering that every time someone tells you to sit down, it might be your moment to stand taller. In the years that followed, Karoline never once called herself a hero. She called herself a student of the law, of people, of justice, and that humility, that relentless commitment to the quiet work of change, is what made her unforgettable. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions don't come from a gavel or a headline. They come from one voice, clear and steady, choosing to tell the truth in a room built to ignore it. Thanks for watching this story about Karoline Leavitt. A powerful reminder that true strength isn't about shouting the loudest, but standing firm in your truth even when the world tries to silence you. If there's one thing to take away, it's this: dignity and justice come to those who refuse to back down, who fight not for glory, but for what's right. If you believe in stories that inspire courage and honor the quiet heroes among us, hit that subscribe button and join us for more real stories that matter. Because together, we keep the flame of justice alive.